jobs is very clear. So I encourage colleagues to reflect not on narrow group solidarity, but on this idea of universal human solidarity, how this bill impacts the whole of the economy, and to look at these various different segments of society, Madam Speaker, and I'd encourage my colleagues to join me in defeating this bill. Thank you.
The honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is my privilege to rise today to support Bill C-234. I'm sure my colleagues won't be surprised about that. Sponsored by my colleague, the member for Jonquière. The last debate on this valuable amendment to the Canada Labour Code was fruitful. All members who spoke raised important questions about both the bill itself and its manner of introduction into the House. And before I speak to the bill in question, I will, if I may, respond to some of the objections we have heard. The Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons expressed his distrust of our motives. This was based on his experience in provincial politics and the NDP's own history of labour-related legislation. He claimed indirectly that this piece of legislation is part of games, and I quote, that are played between the Conservatives and the NDP with respect to labour, end quote. I would like to remind him about the distinction between federal and provincial parties and agendas. I do not hold the federal Liberals responsible for the policies and decisions of their provincial counterparts. This attitude of suspicion really is not helpful for healthy debate and is corrosive, I think, to Canadian politics. Madam Speaker, while I might not agree with them, I respect all of my elected colleagues' opinions, and I equally hold all my colleagues to their word. This is part of good faith discussion and negotiations, without which any bargaining process, whether in the House or over employment conditions, crumbles. My colleague from Louis Saint Laurent took a principled position in opposing our amendment, and while I respect his commitment, I am saddened by his party's continued insistence upon outdated economic theory that sacrifices actual and practical considerations. He said, and I quote, "Let us not forget that striking workers can always go somewhere else to work," end quote. Madam Speaker, individuals are not at their core just economic beings or economic robots that just uproot and abandon their community, their friends, their place, their memory for only financial considerations. And this government should not treat them as such. This brand of economic thought is blind to the realities faced by many working Canadians and insensitive to the demands of everyday life. And sensitive to the demands of everyday life was really at the heart of some of the previous government's destructive economic policies. In addition, Madam Speaker, I would call into question various statistics and citations used by the member from Louis Saint Laurent. First, Madam Speaker, we must all remember that correlation is not causality. The numbers are not, as the member stated, speaking for themselves, but rather the member is speaking for the numbers. Second, while he rightfully pointed to the recommendations of the 1996 Sims Commission, my colleague neglected to mention that the Commission found that Quebec has managed without major difficulty since the general prohibition of replacement workers. He equally neglected to mention the minority opinion of Commissioner member Rodrigue Boulin, who notes that there was neither consensus nor conclusive evidence for the recommendations. Boulin recognized that replacement workers undermine the fundamental principles of bargaining integrity. The member from Louis Saint Laurent did not acknowledge this. Nevertheless, I respect the member's position, his honesty, and his valuable respect for the equality of all members. Now, all members spoke to the balance that exists between employer and employee thanks to the Canada Labour Code and the threat of upending that balance. I commend my colleague from Regina Louvain for his excellent response to this criticism, which was not addressed in subsequent debate, and I wish to return to this point later. First, however, was the member from Cape Breton-Canso's argument for the need of a wide tripartite consultation process instead of piecemeal changes through private members' bills. This process, through deliberation and study, would preserve the employer-employee balance. Madam Speaker, my colleagues' comparison of our amendment to labour law changes under the previous government is disingenuous. Bill C-377 and Bill C-525, two bills given as example, were introduced and shepherded through the Parliament by the previous government, which held consultations in contempt and proactively stifled consensus-building discussion. Bill C-234 has been introduced the only way we know how. The Canada Labour Code requires modernization. If the current government is willing to initiate this consultation process, I say, let's do it. The Liberals, however, will not do this. We are nearing 1 year since the election. The government promised Canadians real change, and they have done better than the previous government, it's true. And of course, transparency and wide and thoughtful considerations are necessary to open government. The current government, however, is employing these consultations with partisan judiciousness, putting us in an awkward position. Where was the broad discussion on arms sales to Saudi Arabia? Where are the consultations on Bill C-51, legislation that blatantly infringes upon charter rights and against which experts from coast to coast have been unified? In fact, where is any whisper that Bill C-51 is being put back on the table? How many more experts must speak out against Bill C-51 before the government acts? In many cases, we've seen deliberate delay masquerading as thorough bipartisan concern. The government is willing to listen, it seems, only when it knows it will like what it hears. I should add, Madam Speaker, that unlike my colleague from Winnipeg North, I am judging this government on its own track record. I want now to return to the carefully crafted balance that my Liberal colleagues spoke of previously. The phrase "sunny ways we know" was popularized by Prime Minister Laurier, a famous compromiser. And yet we also know that Laurier's downfall was ushered in through some of his same compromises. I strongly believe in compromises myself, in listening and negotiating and thoughtfully coming to consensus. But on some issues, talk of balance is misleading. We cannot, for example, support Aboriginal land claims and propose nation-to-nation dialogue and yet greenlight pipeline development without consultation at the same time. To say that we work towards balance in this case is meaningless. We do not need to balance news coverage of climate change with deniers who ignore the science. Likewise, the idea that the current iteration of the Canada Labour Code balances, as the member from Cape Breton Council put it, and I quote, "the union's right to strike with the employer's right to attempt to continue operating during a work stoppage," end quote. Management always has the upper hand in the current scenario, and Bill C-234 is merely trying to balance the playing field. The carefully crafted balance that the government claims exists at the moment between workers and employers under the Canada Labour Code appears to be the same as that which exists between opposition and government here today. Management and the government will always have more resources at their disposal. Furthermore, it's undeniable that the use of scab labour makes strikes more bitter and sometimes violent. They also prolong the conflict, and that doesn't really serve anybody. As the 8-month-long strike at the Chronicle-Herald newspaper in Halifax drags on, the Herald is losing subscribers and advertisers it may never get back. Workers are losing their regular paychecks and the work they so clearly love to do. Any readers that are left will have lost the quality paper of old. Madam Speaker, anti-scab legislation would help reduce days lost to work stoppages and would facilitate a quicker resolution to workplace disputes. In Quebec, where anti-scab legislation has been in place since 1977, and in British Columbia, where a similar law has existed since 1993, days lost to strikes actually decreased since these laws were enacted. These laws must be working, or subsequent governments would have moved to repeal them. The bottom line is that nobody ever wants to go on strike, says Ingrid Beaumont, president of the Halifax Typographical Union, whose members are still on strike. When we went out, it wasn't because we want more, it was because management wants to take away so much. We are striking in self-defense. She goes on to say, strike pay is much less than what you are used to getting if you live paycheck paycheck to paycheck, slow down, it becomes a problem, and the company is using that as a weapon to bully us into surrendering. They have much deeper pockets than we do. The balance is altogether tipped in the employer's favour. Bill C-234 will extend a ray of sunshine to Canadian workers under the Canada Labour Code. This legislation will restore good faith negotiations at the bargaining table, as both parties, employers and employees alike, will have something to lose by not coming to an agreement. This is not naive theory. This is just a simple fact. Thank you, Madam Speaker.